Hi, we're starting off with something I would like to call history through anime. Now we kick this off with a long runner that is actually still on air right now with its 5th season in this fall 2024 anime season, and that is Kingdom. Kingdom is based on a manga of the same name by author Hara Yasuhisa, and the story tells of was essentially the unification campaign of the first emperor of China. Granted, this is a historic manga and an anime based on historic manga. The term based on is pretty loosely used. So what happens is that events in the anime did happen in history. Now how the events happened and what the detail is told is purely the creation of the author. The author did take a lot of creative liberty. It's not a faithful adaptation of history, unlike your average historic dramas. This one has a lot of fictionalization. But generally, the whole premise and the whole idea, major events, everything else is based on the unification of China by the first emperor. Now, the main character in the show is actually not the first emperor of China. It's actually a general named Xin. Of course, the author made up an entire backstory of the character in the show, which is not accurate in history. Historically, the same general, Xin, actually came from a low-ranking noble family, prominent enough inside what was, at that time, the kingdom of Qin. Now, in the anime, they made his background completely up. He wasn't a slave in real life that was freed. And most of the history at that time, which granted was about 2,500 years ago, they didn't have detailed recording and tally of each and every one single person's life. Therefore, we don't know what happened to him every year inside his entire life. So it kind of makes sense for the author to make it up. The way the manga actually did it was captivating enough and intriguing enough that it grabs your attention. It's just that we get more detail with the author filling in the gaps on historic records that didn't record everything. The first emperor of China plays an important role as a very prominent side character in this. Now it's worth mentioning that he might be the first emperor of China, but he wasn't the establisher of the first dynasty of China. Most people will be confused by this. I've even seen TV shows where they actually messed this up. Granted, it wasn't a really well thought after TV show. It's a TV show about ancient aliens essentially, but still, the mistakes were made. Confusions were made. Generally speaking, the first dynasties in China was far less centralized. They didn't have an emperor at first. What they had was a king, and the king was also known as Son of Heaven. And the whole system was set up similar to a feudal system in Europe. Notice I didn't say any specific countries in Europe. It really felt like the entirety of Europe. And the king, also known as Son of Heaven, he was a nominal figure essentially, similar to how Pope was in Europe. He held high prestige and more or less nominal power for the first few dynasties. But in terms of actual real control over the entirety of China, he almost had nothing. And eventually, prominent regional lords rose up enough that they started naming themselves king, therefore making whatever land they ruled over individual kingdoms. And of course, the Son of Heaven could do nothing towards that. And eventually, his own territory was swallowed up by one of these kingdoms. Eventually, these individual kingdoms form up into 7 really strong ones, and the first emperor of China started off as one of these kings, and he gradually just gobbled up each and every other kingdoms, and therefore unifying the entire land under a more centralized control compared to other dynasties. And in order to make him more prominent, he actually made the title of emperor compared to king or just Son of Heaven before. So that's why he's the first emperor of China, but not the establisher of the first dynasty of China, mainly because first few dynasties of China were organized differently from the point onward, from the first emperor's rule. This story essentially up till now follows the earlier campaigns in his life, where he started unifying China and attacking each and every kingdoms and fighting wars against one another during the period. And our protagonist will be a general under him, serving him throughout this campaign. Even though it's a historic anime, because of the scarcity of records from that period in history, we get a lot of creative liberty. Therefore, we have less limitations and a captivating enough story. And if you're interested in that kind of story, you can actually give it a watch. It's on 5th season right now, so there are 5 seasons. A long show, sure, but you can't go in as you would for something like, say, Game of Thrones. And the show is popular enough and the period in time is interesting enough that I guarantee you it's gonna keep you captivated. And since it's a long runner, you'll never be short of things to watch later on.